Om Tridevibhyo Namaha. Welcome back to Trishakti Healing. If you've decided to watch this video, either there is an answer like this that you're looking for or you're very curious about this subject. Either which way, stay with me. This is a very serious topic and I'm going to cover some very important things, especially for our society today where many of us have forgotten our roots and we have gotten so much influenced by external cultures, external fads, which are a lot of unnecessary things that have come. In fact, it's even more serious to understand that over the last about 800-900 years, the culture of our country, the Sanatana Dharma, the overall influence of our Vedas, Shastras, etc., has been significantly degraded because of the elimination and systematic culling of things like the Guru Shishya Parampara or the Gurukuls, or much of our literature being destroyed by crusaders, etc. So, coming back also to why am I speaking about free will versus non-adherence versus spiritual life? The choice of that topic itself comes from the fact that I've been speaking to all of you over the last 2-3 months about Bhagya and what is really Bhagya or destiny. Where does it come from? How does one get to understand what my real Bhagya is? What are my activities which will destroy my Bhagya or make my Bhagya? So when I was doing this, I began getting a lot of questions, especially from my young audience. Boys and girls started asking me this question: what is a spiritual life? Why must I look at a spiritual life? What is free will? How much of free will should I exert? Is it wrong to exert free will? What can happen if I do this? When does free will become non-adherence? When do free will and non-adherence take me away from a real spiritual life? And many other questions like this. That's why I thought I will take this opportunity to talk to you about free will versus non-adherence versus really living a spiritual informed life. But for me to also speak about this, and I wrote a lot and there were many things that I wanted to talk to you about, but I thought, let me first tell you a story, because as I was preparing to talk to you about this, I remembered the stories of some people who have either lived a very good spiritual life or they have created a lot of challenges for themselves in their life because of exercising their free will and non-adherence. So here is the story of these 4 friends. I will tell you the story in about 5-10 minutes and then I'll go to the learnings of their story and what came out of their story to help you understand free will versus non-adherence versus a spiritual life. So these 4 friends were believer, curious, rebel and reckless. Obviously, I've chosen these names so that you can understand the essence of the message of this video. So these 4, rebel, reckless, curious and believer, they were friends for a long time and they were friends from school, college, and they used to fairly regularly meet at this certain place which was a huge tree and some stalls, and this was a place in between a school and a temple, and it was in their city and it was there for long. For them it was a commonplace thing to meet there about 6:30 in the evening and go on sitting there about 8-9. Even their parents knew that they would meet there very often, and this continued through school, continued through college. And I think it was around their 22nd year or something that they suddenly were getting into very serious discussions about what is life, how do we build our life, what is exploration. And that's how one of those days they got into a very serious argument. And that serious argument got to a place where it almost literally pulled them completely apart. But why did that happen? For that you have to understand a little bit more about the character of these 4 people. So let's look at believer. Believer came from a fairly simple family. Yes, believer had a lot of ambitions, wanted to learn, wanted to grow, wanted to materially achieve things. But believer also came from a family which always explained to believer the importance of guru, granth, jnana, of traditions, of understanding, of getting answers from Vedas, Upanishads, etc. And at some point in time, believer always used to balance out the exploration of life with what is there, the knowledge that has been offered. And there was a deep interest that believer had in discovering self and discovering life and wanting to ensure that the Prarabdha that he was born with is exhausted in this life. And that's something that from a very young age he had. Whereas let's look at Curious. For Curious also was from a simple family, he had a lot of ambitions. But Curious, even though had been taught about the importance of Guru Granth Gyan and Vedas, etc., like the family, was always a very experimentative person. At any given point in time, he wanted a proof, pramana, so that he could see what life would become. And if he experimented with certain things, and when the experimentation gave a positive result, he knew that he could continue. But he was also smart. Whenever the experimentation gave even a slightly negative result or a bad feeling, he would quickly trace back his path to the roots from where he had started his life. And that was the path of the Vedas and the Upanishad and our Sanskriti. On the other hand, let's look at rebel and reckless now. So, rebel's favorite way was to argue against anything. Anything that had any kind of structure, any kind of rules, regulations was something that rebel could not tolerate. Family structures, societal structures, religious or dharmic structures, any institution, government, wherever he saw anything which was organized and systematic, for him it was something that was tying you down, and he had to naturally fight against it. And this was almost instinctual. For him, it was not about is the system right or wrong. It was simply that every system is wrong. Everything that is organized has to be challenged, has to be broken. That's the only way you can remain free. Reckless had a lot of those qualities of rebel, but there was one key difference between rebel and reckless. Rebel still had the ability to understand when he was just about going overboard, and he was also very street smart to get out of situations without really getting harmed by whatever he was doing. However, reckless on the other hand was outright rebel all through and through. No consequences could stop him. He had to experiment with life. He had to do everything that was said you should not or cannot do in life. That's the character which they brought into that evening's conversation. And when they started speaking about life, they came to a point where they said, look, we can't deal with this anymore. Let's break this. Let's not meet after today. And if we have to meet, let's spend the next 20, 30 years exploring life, and let's see who gets ahead in life, who's satisfied, who's happy, who becomes something in life. And let's meet back here at the end of 30 years, same place at around 7:30 in the evening. They said, they parted, they went their ways. Believer decided to stay back in his city. Believer knew he was born into a certain context, certain family. He had to do what he had to do. So he took on a job, various other things that he did. He learned, he grew, he struggled, he worked with relationships, through relationships, had several challenges, setbacks, got married, reared a family, took care of his parents, various other challenges, achieved a lot in life, materially, spiritually, grew, thought, had a lot of lessons because of the learnings, but continued to believe in Guru, Grantha, Jnana, always making sure that he was progressing spiritually as much as materially. So as a sum total at any given point in time, when you asked believer, how are you doing? The answer was good, I'm learning, I'm getting better. I have a lot that is on my plate. Some of these things are very challenging. Sometimes I feel like quitting, but I always go back to my roots and I get the strength. And that's how believer's life was continuing. Believer continued with one ritual. He always used to go back to that place where the four of them used to meet at least a couple of times in the week, and spends about 15-20 minutes. He used to really miss his friends. And knowing that all three of them had left the city, he had no other recourse but to wait. But he remembered that commitment and hoped that his friends also remembered. One day, suddenly, and I think it was the 19th year after they all separated and they went their way, Curious was spotted walking towards that point at which they used to meet. And this was around 7:38 in the evening, when Believer was sitting there sipping tea, waiting. And he was surprised to see Curious coming his way, but also very happy that one of his friends was back. They both struck a conversation. Believer very surprised that Curious was back in the 19th year only, and Curious relieved to know that Believer was still there and one of his friends was there for him to share life. He has also done very well in his life, learned a lot, traveled to many lands, went to a lot of countries, stayed with different kinds of people, different civilizations, gained a lot, progressed in his career. But then he confessed to Believer that at some point in time he realized that he was missing his roots. Going away from his family, his roots was beginning to kill him. Going away from his context was killing him, and there was so much that he had left behind. It always invariably felt that no matter what he did, there was something not right. There was something that was empty within him because he had run away from his life. And that feeling has not just come a day or two back or a month or two back. That feeling had been growing for the last 5, 10, 15 years. So he said, even though I exercised my free will and my life allowed me some latitude to go, experiment, and it also gave me the resources, life at some point in time was continuing to show me that this is not right. I have to come back to my roots. And remember what I told you about the character of Curious. He had this ability to reflect and to listen to life's messages. And that's essentially what happened. So he came back, they both resumed their friendship, they again started meeting. They both learned a lot from each other over the next few years. Curious because he had traveled to so many civilizations and places, he had a lot to teach to Believer. Believer because he had grown deep with his roots, had always embraced his context and the spiritual life. He had delved deep into elements like Shraddha, Saburi, Samarpan, which are hallmarks of Bhakti Yoga. He had a lot to offer in terms of spiritual wisdom to Curious. Curious had a lot of worldly wisdom to offer to Believer. They both continued their sharings, learnings, etc. And suddenly came a point, and this was around the 24th year or something, they were both having a very long conversation one day in the evening. And fairly late in the evening, they saw a figure, a very recognizable yet not so recognizable figure coming towards them. And both of them looked at each other and said, "Oh my God, that's a rebel." A person who was tall, handsome, very strongly built, was not even half of his original structure. The complexion had gone away, his skin tone, his health was really bad, stooping shoulders, a very shaky walk. Rebel comes and sits next to both of them and feels very relieved to find these two friends there, but couldn't muster the courage to say anything. The other two, being much wiser for their age, understood that he had been through a lot. They allowed him to be, not just that day, but for the next several weeks they allowed him to be. Slowly Rebel started opening up and speaking. Rebel mentioned how he worked at several places, had many relationships, did a lot, but for him, where he had started, and if you remember what I told about Rebel's character, for him anything that had a structure, anything that was organized, he had to break that. So he did not live the norms of organization, live the norms of relationships, live the norms of places that he had. He had picked up a lot of bad habits, did a lot of experimentation with his life also. Though Curious also had done the experimentation, but the kind of experimentations Rebel told both of them, Believer and Curious, about, they were really, very scary. It sent a chill up the spine of both of the other friends when he described all the things that he had done. And Rebel came to a point where he said, 3 years back, his life turned to hell with all those experiments because he understood that at some point in time his luck had run out completely. And he says, somewhere his family had some grounding and some faith that they had saved him because he had got onto the wrong side of law itself some 3 years back. And now that all of that was behind and over, he thought he would come looking for his friends, and he was so happy to see both of them there. And they understood how much of a challenge exercising the free will and going to a level of non-adherence itself with life had created with rebel's life. But as they grow deeper into these conversations and exchanges over the next few months, they also realized that they had no news of Reckless, and this was almost about the 25th year now. And they started looking and figuring out, and one day they get this message that Reckless had passed away in a very dangerous accident, and it was really bad. His death was very painful, very traumatic, and something really bad had happened to him. And that bad had happened because of all the choices that Reckless had made. So I will pause this story here because I've introduced the characters, their life and all that went through. So now for you to look at. So let's look at Believer, Curious, Rebel and Reckless and see how each one of them did exercise some amount of free will, made choices. So what is free will really? Free will essentially is when you want to do certain things with life. Life supports you, it gives you resources. You may also make some mistakes here and there, but life gives you signals and very quickly you learn with those signals. So free will in its true essence is also responsible freedom. And in that responsible freedom, you are continuously listening to life and life's signals. And when you do that over a period of time, you learn to regulate your free will and you come around to a path which actually is spiritual in nature. And what is really spiritual life? A spiritual life, first of all, is understanding yourself, understanding God, God's way, this world, why things are arranged in a certain way. Why is the importance of Guru, Grantha, Jnana, all of these things which is there. And how do you really learn from that and regulate your life? Spiritual life is also about internalizing things like Shraddha, which is having deep devotional focus towards your life, Lord, this universe. It's also about Saburi, which is patience and surrenderance to life. It's also about Samarpan, which is really actually putting your faith in the hands of the universe and this whole system that God has created, which is called life. That is what a spiritual life is. And yes, through that, spiritual life is also about improvements, learning, growth, doing well for yourself, enhancing your capabilities, achieving things. These are also spiritual things. But those are not the ends of being spiritual. Being spiritual is to work with the life that you have got, work through the life that you've got. Do you exercise some amount of free will in that? Yes, you can. You do. But what you have to see is when you exercise free will, if you get positive results, continue doing that. But if you get negative results, you also have to learn and change your ways. That's when that becomes responsible freedom. What happens though when you behave like a rebel or a reckless? You continue to challenge a system. You continue to exercise your free will for your short-term gains, for your short-term pleasures. Everything in life is dispensable. You can change relationships, you can change places, you can change choices, you can do whatever you want, you can pick up any sort of habit and do whatever it is. Then it is really not free will. It is non-adherence. It is very irresponsible freedom that you are living with. So next time you are, you have a burning desire to do something, do test that idea. If you don't get positive consequences, don't get into it with all these Western methodologies of manifestations and, I will exercise my free will and I will live on my own terms and all that. It doesn't work. Because what you have to realize is that if you don't exhaust your Prarabdha, if you don't live your life within the boundaries of the life that has been given to you, if you continue pushing your free will, despite negative consequences, you are going to come to a place where your luck is going to run out. Remember that luck that you have is like a bank account. Too much of free will used and that bank account runs sooner or later. And at some point in time, that irresponsibility of your life is going to catch up with you and it's going to be a very dangerous place for you to be. In fact, look at the danger that happened to the fourth friend, Reckless, who through all the choices that he made, which were very similar to the choices that Rebel was making, got to a point that he had to die a very bad death. There was not too much of a difference between what Rebel and Reckless were doing. But rebel had that realization that life is continuously doing something which is negative or saying something negative to me, which means I need to stop doing what I am saying. And somewhere he paid heed to his family and put a stop to things. But what happened to reckless? Reckless did things to finally lose life. Now, I'm not saying that your luck will run out and you will also die a very bad death. No, that's not the message. But you have to remember that some people can have a life which is death-like also because of the irresponsible choices that they're making in life. So when you go too far away from spiritual life, when you are so much into your free will, wanting to change everything about life, when you become so non-adherent with life, when you don't want to pay any attention to what your life is and improving that life systematically, when you make all these kind of bad choices, you don't have to meet death, but you can meet a life which becomes death-like. What happens then? What happens then when you have diseases or challenges or so much of bad karma piled onto you that there is no latitude for you to move anywhere? That, my friends, is a far more dangerous situation to be as compared to death itself. So, hope you have got a good understanding of what a spiritual life is versus what free will is versus what non-adherence is. I will continue speaking to you on this topic and go a lot more deeper. The next video that I bring will be a lot more deeper into these words, a lot more structured into the idea, the concept of this. Today, I wanted to tell you the story of these four friends and leave a little bit of that idea with you so that you watch out for where you are overextending your free will, because very quickly you could become non-adherent. Very quickly you could go away from the path of spirituality and a spiritual life. Very quickly you could end up creating a lot of bad karma for yourself. So be conscious about your life. Be careful about your life. I will come back and speak to you very soon in a lot more detail on this topic. Till then, take good care of yourself. Jai Mahakal, Jai Mahakali.